Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you for another Film Fanatic show. This is going to be a little bit of a different kind of a show. This is a specialty show. I've done quite well at this point. I've done quite a few music shows. I've done some shows and talks about music and bands that I really really love, and I actually did a show on very specific. They were very specific music oriented kind of things where I did a show on Autechre, which is my favorite electronic group of all time. I did a show on my favorite form of extreme music, and that is black metal. I did two shows for that, part one and a part two. I did one where I talked about a lot of the second wave of bands that I grew up on in the early '90s, and then I did a second show where I talked about a lot of newer bands that I just recently discovered. So I also did a show on my favorite death metal band of all time, and that is Morbid Angel. I did a show about the. I got to see them in concert this year, so it was very very cool. So I that music really extreme metal in general, but death metal, black metal, especially black metal. Black metal is my favorite form of extreme metal or extreme music. I just love the aesthetic around it. It creates, I feel like, and again, it's just me personally, but for me, it's more about just a vibe, and it's more about creating like this blanket of emotion. I mean, death metal obviously has that too, but there's something about black metal that, for me, just personally, goes a little bit deeper and there's something about it that's a little bit more hypnotic. So I went to a pretty amazing show. I'm wearing one of the. I got a shirt from my great friend Mike, who bought me the shirt, and that is a Cannibal Corpse shirt, Eaten Back to Life. Got it last week from my buddy Mike for birthday present, and we had gotten tickets about 3 or 4 months ago to go see Cannibal Corpse, Mayhem, Gorguts, and also Blood Incantation. And the show was last night, and so this show is going to be about the experience, about the actual experience of seeing these bands, and in particular around Cannibal Corpse and especially Mayhem, the venue, and all those things. So I had gone to the Palladium for the first time this year. Actually, we went. My friend Sam and I, who also went last night, we had gone down there to see Morbid Angel, and that was a phenomenal show, amazing. And there's two venues within, and it was at the Worcester, the Palladium. And there's basically the Palladium is a really awesome venue, but there's two venues within it. There's a small room that holds, like, I don't know, I think six to 800 people. That is on the upstairs, and then there's the downstairs, which is the big the big venue, which holds a few thousand. I think it holds about 3,000 or something like that. And so last night's show, we went. The three of us went. I drove down. I picked up my friend Mike. He lives really close to here. I picked him up on the way, and then we we drove down to Portland, and then a friend Sam, who lives down in Portland, drove the rest of the way. So it was about a little under 2 hours for me to get to Portland, or about 2 hours, and then from there another 2 hours. So it was about, altogether a 4 hour trip. So, and I have to say that I had never been to that venue before, to the big space, and it's amazing. It's an amazing venue. Really impressive. I was blown away by it. I love the way it's set up. I like that if you want it to be, you want to get low down and crazy and go in the mosh pit, you can do that. But if you want to just sit and comfortably watch the show, you can kind of get out of it and be, in a super cool, safe space and just concentrate on checking out the music. And the way it's laid out is fantastic. The sound is really great. It's a beautiful theater, and it's big. It's big, but yet it's got this very intimate thing about it, which is really great. I love. I'm not a huge fan as I've gotten older. I'm not a huge fan of like the big festival kinds of crowds where there's like thousands and thousands of people, and then when you're seeing the band on stage, they look like little mini ants or something. I like generally I've always liked it, but I generally really like the smaller shows where it's like intimate and you feel like you're close to this band and you're feeding off of that energy and then you're giving that energy back and it's just kind of more intimate. That's the kind of thing I love. And so this was a really cool theater because it was, I don't know, kind of the best of both worlds. It's like it's a big place. It's about the size of roughly about the size of the State Theater in Portland, which is a big venue, and it holds a few thousand people. But yet, it's the way it's set up. It feels intimate, and it's very, very cool. And it was funny on the way down to Worcester to the concert. It started raining, and we none of us had checked the weather. Like a typical thing that I just don't do a lot of the times because it is what it is. So none of us had checked the weather, and we drove down. And the last stretch of the trip before we got down to Worcester, it just rained, it was torrential downpour. And then we got there, we still made really good time. We had all kinds of time to get. Once we got down to Worcester, we parked, found parking, and then we had plenty of time to like chill out. And we decided to, we went out for dinner and stuff. But it was great because we had so much time. We didn't have to rush or anything. And we had this whole conversation on the way down that like, we've all had that experience, with other people where, if you go to a show, and it seems to happen a lot with like metal shows, that, a lot of the times your buddies will want to like drink a lot of beer before or don't really care at all about the opening bands, and they just want to go. They just really want to show up just in time to see the headlining band. And a lot of the times for these shows, they have multiple bands opening up, and I've always hated that. I've always been a person that, you're paying for the ticket. You're using your hard-earned money to go see music and something you really love doing. And why would you not want to get there and see the entire show and experience the whole event for the money that you spent? So we're kind of all in that same boat about thinking, as far as like, okay, let's see the whole show, and we've done that. So we've done that in the past, and that's what we did last night. And so we had plenty of time. We had dinner and just kind of relaxed, and it was great. We kind of hung out, met this guy who was a little bit. I don't know. He was a little bit. I don't know how to describe. He was a little bit odd. There was something odd. Well, I'm kind of an odd person, but he was kind of. There was something about him that was a little bit weird. I don't know. And he was a total, metalhead guy. He had a Cannibal Corpse hoodie on, and so he was going to the show, and we were the only guys there to see Cannibal Corpse. At least I could tell when we got there. And then after we were done and we paid for our bill, paid for our food, there was quite a few people that were coming in that were going to the show, because we found out after we parked or after we started eating, Sam found out that the show was totally sold out, which I wasn't surprised by because Cannibal Corpse is definitely in the world of death metal. They are the biggest name. I mean, they're huge, and so it's not a surprise. So, and Mayhem also is, a huge name in the black metal world. So you have these two iconic bands that have been around for like 35 years, pushing 40 years, and the amount of records they have out, the amount of tours, and just all the things they've done, all the things they've accomplished, and they're still doing overall amazing things, and they still have the same passion and energy. It's not a surprise that that the show would sell out, and especially the Palladium is a venue that, really, really has a lot of shows, especially metal shows. They constantly have shows there, so it's a big destination for metal bands and for rock shows and all those kinds of things. So this guy we were talking to at the bar, like he was, we were in the same bands, and we started talking a lot about Morbid Angel. He had seen Morbid Angel a bunch of times, and I was like, wow, like that's cool. So he ended up kind of just standing around, and then he's like, hey, can I join you guys? So we're like, okay, and sure. And then we like remember giving him chicken nuggets and stuff once he sat down, and it was pretty funny. But he was cool, and then he sat with us for a while, and then we got done eating, and then it was still pouring rain, and then we went outside, and as we were walking out, I saw this guy who, kind of an older guy, not much older than me, but an older guy. He looked super familiar, and he had said something to Mike about the weather really sucking or whatever, because it was total downpour at that point. And I'm like, where do I know this guy? And then I was like, oh, I totally know who this guy is. And I went up to him, and I was like, hey, are you one of the guys that goes on this YouTube channel show that I really like called the Accusation Network, and you sometimes you're like a guest kind of host of that show? And I was like, yep, this is totally him. And he's like, yeah, that's me. And I was like, no shit. And it was super funny because he's on this show called the Accusation Network, which is a metal show, and he's on there sometimes as like a guest. And he talks about his vinyl collection, and he's really great. And so I thought that was pretty funny, and he was going to the show. And anyway, we got to the venue, and we were there pretty early, like I said, but the line was moving quick. And it was raining, it was cold out, but the line was moving fast, and it was like, so we didn't have to wait very long, maybe 5 or 10 minutes. Considering how many people were there, it wasn't a long wait. And so that was pretty awesome. And we got inside, and we had plenty of time. And the first band that came out was a band called Blood Incantation. Blood Incantation is like a newer band that's been around for a few years. It's interesting. It's a kind of a hard thing to describe, but when I first heard them, I liked them. I thought they were pretty interesting. And then I bought a couple of their albums, and they've been around for a few years. And I bought a couple of their albums and started listening to them, and I found myself not really digging the albums. I didn't know what it was. I gave it a chance, the album that I bought, or albums that I bought of them, and I gave them a chance multiple times, and I'm still not like giving up on it, but I just couldn't find that thread or ingredient that made me interested in the music. I don't know what it was. And then I started thinking, well, maybe it's, and I've heard people criticize them to a degree, but they're also a newer band that has really exploded the last couple of years. Like they've been doing these major tours. They've become a really big name, and the tours and things that they've been doing, and they've become really high profile. And here they are opening up for Mayhem and Cannibal Corpse. I mean, it doesn't really get any bigger than that, and so it's pretty wild to see how their ascension, their ascension has been. But I don't know, and I felt like the thing that I wasn't really digging about their stuff was that their songs don't feel like songs in your traditional form. Like there's not. It feels like when you listen to some of their songs or their tunes, they all sound like bits and pieces of various kinds of tunes, but they're not related together. And it feels like at the end of the day, they're all just tacked on together. And there's their songs are incredibly busy. There's so many parts. There's so many different things going on. There's a lot of odd meters and time signatures, which is cool. They definitely have a prog rock influence, very psychedelic, and also an electronica element, which is cool, which is something I love about them or like about them. But it feels like their songs, there's nothing like, it feels like a lot of the stuff, the arrangements, everything is forced, and everything seems a little bit out of context. So it's really hard to grasp onto some of their songs because it's so I don't know, it has this very choppy effect, and it feels like when you listen to one of their songs, they could have taken those parts and made about five other tunes out of them, and they so essentially I get this feeling like they take they come up with these riffs or these little sections, and then they just tack them together for the sake of calling it a song to a degree. And it's weird. It's a weird thing. But I just feel like their songs are not really cohesive, and there's not any riffs or anything that make me feel like there's something catchy about it or that it's memorable. There's certain things about their music I really like. I think they have a real, they definitely have a big time like Morbid Angel influence. I think. Um, I like the psychedelic. I like the electronica stuff that they incorporate into their music with the synths. They actually put out an ambient album last year, which is all straight up basically ambient music. You know, kind of in the vein of like you know Tangerine Dream or like Brian Eno, like just pure ambient music. And there's some, you know, I like it. I kind of have a little bit of a mixed feeling with that too. I kind of feel like it's good, but I don't know. There's something about it that's similar to that record to how I feel about their music. Like it's got some great moments, but it feels like I don't know. It always feels like some elements of their music is forced. I don't know, but they were the opening band last night, and they were pretty good. I think you know their musicianship in the band is pretty amazing. They have some moments in the music where I think it is very cool. They have a good stage presence. The sound was pretty well. The sound was okay. It was a little bit muffled when they came out, which is a thing. You know, it's kind of the tradition of when you go see bands, the opening band, the sound kind of always sucks or is not so good. And then when the headlining band comes out, it's like, oh wait, all of these speakers work. Um, it's always a funny thing. But they were, you know, as far as an opening band, it was pretty good, pretty entertaining. You know, they're definitely a higher level caliber band than your average band. Next band was Gorguts, and the Gorguts I forgot about them because they were a band that I listened to. I had a few of their albums when I was a kid. Was I was into them for a while. I was into a bunch of European bands and Swedish bands at the time, death metal bands like Dismember, Benediction, The Unleashed. I remember Gorguts was another band I really liked a lot, and I had a couple of their albums. And they're an interesting band. They have this kind of like old school, like early '90s, late '80s kind of more traditional European death metal kind of sound. But then they also have a little bit of like this proggy experimental edge to their music, and they were pretty good. I was impressed. They did some interesting things. They played a lot of stuff from their older period as a band. They've been around for years, and I kind of forgot about them for some reason. And I was impressed. They played some pretty good stuff. They were entertaining. They had a really cool rapport with the crowd. And there was I don't know. They finished off the set with some of their more recent tunes. I guess they just put out a newer album fairly recently, and they were pretty. It was good. It was like a little bit more kind of contemporary sounding, but it still had that traditional sound, and it definitely had a little bit more of a proggy kind of almost, yeah, like fusiony kind of sound. Where there was a little bit of some odd meter stuff going on, some interesting weird time signatures and shifts in like the way the melody would work in the song. But they were cool, and I thought they were pretty good. So I was like, wow, like this is crazy, like this is pretty cool for having for two opening bands, and they both played pretty long. Like they played a good set, like 35 minutes. So for the package deal, I think as being a fan of this music or being just a tax-paying consumer, you're getting your fucking money's worth. I'm like, this is great. And I remember it was funny when we were hanging out before Blood Incantation went out on stage. I turned to those guys and I had said, "Wow," and I looked at the clock and it was 6:30, and the first band was scheduled to come out at 6:30, so it was like a couple minutes before Blood Incantation came out, um, and I was like, "Wow!" Like today's been a long day, and I was like, I didn't realize it was 6:30, and I'm like, "Wow!" I left my house at 10 this morning, and we've been going since, and I'm like, "Holy shit!" And music hasn't even started yet, so I was like, "Wow!" Like this is a super long day, but great day. And so after Gorguts was done, the next band that was coming up, and I was kind of beyond words of how excited I was to see them. And that the band that was up next was Mayhem, and Mayhem is one of the most I think when it comes, especially when it comes to metal in general, but especially black metal, I feel like they're one of the the kind of the kingpins or like the godfather of that sound. There's a lot of bands that helped kind of curate that sound and developed it when it first came out on the scene, like the whole second wave scene of black metal, where you had these kids that grew up in Europe and also in America that were listening to bands like Iron Maiden, Motorhead, and punk bands like Discharge, but then they were listening to Venom and things like that, and Celtic Frost, Black Sabbath, and they kind of created this new unique sound. And those bands that I just mentioned, Merciful Fate, they're looked at to a degree as like the first wave of black metal, even though at that time it wasn't really a term that was used or a genre name or a genre tag that was used. But the second wave, they always refer to it, was when a formative new style came out of those influences. Like, you had bands like Burzum, Dark Throne, Immortal, Impale Nazarene, Beherit, Emperor, and of course Mayhem. So the list is endless. And there was a scene that happened in America, but then also in Norway at the time. And Norway and in Europe, it really took hold because they were known for being really, really, well, to a degree elitist, but they were really hardcore about pushing the imagery and the whole kind of aesthetic, and at first coming across, well, being very anti-Christian, being very, you know, wanting to reintroduce, kind of pagan mythology and pagan philosophy into the society, and paying homage to darkness, things in nature, things in like the natural law or the natural state of things, if you will. And so a lot of the music was very pure, but it was also very militant and very hardcore, very very theatrical. Where the use of like corpse paint, and another band that really paid a huge influence on this style. I would say, the bands, like all of those bands really created that sound or as influences that I just mentioned, Motorhead and Black Sabbath and things like that. But I think the three bands for me that really ushered that whole new thing was like Hellhammer, which was Celtic Frost's first band before Celtic Frost became Celtic Frost. Bathory, which is arguably probably the first black metal actual artist, with the style of the vocals, the high raspy vocals, and Venom. I think like those three bands were the groups that, and I would have to throw Merciful Fate in there too, but those three bands especially. But Mayhem was basically one of the first bands, arguably, if not the first band that kind of created a style. And they have a notorious history of all kinds of craziness in their career. And, it's all been talked about. It's all been, you know, a lot of the myths around it have been proven to be true, and some things or some myths have been that became things of like sensationalized, incredibly sensationalized headlines were proven to be kind of blown out of proportion. But also, there were a lot of things and events that happened during those events in Europe that were very much true, as far as how extreme the climate was. With there were cases of where people got murdered, and there were churches that got burnt down. There was, all kinds of criminal activity that did go on, and lots of controversy, to say the least. But Mayhem kind of survived all of that stuff somehow. And now I would say, arguably, close to, over 30 years, close to 40 years later, they're kind of bigger than they've ever done. The audiences that they play for, the crowds, the tours they go on, everything. And it's amazing that were able to stay around and weather the storm, especially in their early part of their career, which would have crushed their many bands in the past. And they actually, at one point, they did, when their lead singer died, and all of these tragedies happened. They at one point, did call it a day, but then they came back, and so they went through these periods where they took it all on, and they went against all the odds, and here we are now. And for me, they're one of the most important bands in the black metal scene, absolute living legends. And so I was beyond thrilled to see them. And I have to say, the whole night there was some really great music. And Cannibal, which I'll get into in a minute, was amazing. They were ferocious. But I have to say, at the end of the night, Mayhem was the highlight for me. To see them live, for me, they stole the show. And it was for them, for what they did and for what they did last night, and their whole vibe, their whole aesthetic. Like, they just gave, I felt like they just gave everybody in attendance a completely different and unique experience. I felt like you were watching a really good horror movie. It's what it felt like, or like a theater piece. And it was interesting because it was like, they played a nice long set, and you're obviously, every band, when they come out and they do a performance, they have a set list and they play their songs, and that's what they're showcasing. But it felt like the way they kind of mixed things up. They played a lot of old stuff, a lot of new stuff, and then stuff in the 80s and 90s. They really played the set was really varied, and I like that. So they played a lot of different things. But it was interesting because it felt like, as opposed to like maybe one or two songs being, or their songs really sticking out, it kind of gave me this feeling like everything was like it was all one big song. Like, everything just kind of blended in. And it wasn't about this, like, one. I mean, they obviously played some songs that were huge hits, or not huge hits, but that are very popular, like Freezing Moon, and and things like that, Death Crush, and things from their early stage that were massive and so influential on the scene. And they played songs like that, and obviously that was a highlight. But everything else, it felt like everything worked as like one big piece or movement. And it was just about, for me, it was about the vibe and the aesthetic that they were creating. Like, the way they used the lighting, and they had these really cool lights on stage, and all you could see was their silhouettes, and and they had this massive like fog machine going, and the combination of the makeup and the stage craft that they used for their performance, it was like a theater piece, and it was so cool because it was subtle, but yet it was saying a lot, and I just loved it, and it was very theatrical, and it felt like I was watching like an old school Hammer movie, like an old school Christopher Lee Dracula movie. Like it was so awesome and just really immersive. And none of the other bands really have that kind of vibe per se. They don't really. That's not really their thing. So it was really, I don't know. It was beautiful. It was scary. It was horrific. It was also soothing in its own weird way and hypnotic. And it had this very ethereal kind of quality to it, even though the music's very harsh and dark and intense. It had this real ethereal quality to it. It had a very meditative quality to it also. It was amazing, and I was really taken aback by how great they were, and how I could have, honestly, I could have listened to them for the rest of the night. I was like, these guys should just keep playing because they were just fantastic, fantastic. And they did all these little things where they used this like these interesting little bits of like intro music, and they would take these little breaks and like in between songs, and the lights would go dark, and then this music that would come on that was just really cool, like kind of this ambient neoclassical, dark kind of wave stuff that would come on. They would take these little breaks and then go backstage, and then they would come out and they'd be wearing robes, or they'd have some kind of other costume change, and it was just really cool and really dramatic, and it kept you interested, but it kind of gave you a sense of like you're on the edge of your seat, and you're like, wow, what, I can't wait to see what they do next or what they play next. And I like that they played a lot of variety of things too. They really changed up what they were doing. It wasn't like necessarily all like fast tunes or all slow tunes. They really mixed up the tempos. They really mixed the moods up. It was very cool. Attila, who is the lead singer for Mayhem, is one of my all time favorite singers, and I love that he can really sing melodically, but then he can do the deep growls, and he can do the real like high, trebly black metal vocals, and he can go from through all of these ranges at the drop of a dime, and it's gorgeous, and it's kind of this, not only I think is he a great singer, just from being a singer, but I think he is like I think like with what he does with his vocals, to a degree, is almost like a next level thing of where it feels like it's literally another instrument, like he uses it like somebody would use a synth or a guitar, or it's not just a vehicle to sing lyrics. It's very interesting, and they all work in this way that creates this tapestry of sound, as opposed to like one person sticking out. It was very, very cool. I was very, very impressed, to say the least. And again, like I said, I left the feeling of like by the time they were getting close to the end of their set. I was like craving to. I would have been fine if they just kept going. Like it was pretty magical. So, and of course, I was like, wow, like holy, they finally finished, and then after that, I was like, holy shit, Cannibal Corpse is still gonna come out, and I'm like, oh my god, this is crazy. And there was the Palladium was sold out, and there was few thousand people there. Like it was crazy. It was packed, and it was nuts. The energy was amazing. And when Cannibal came out, they just crushed it. I mean, they were just brutal as all hell. They just tore people's heads off, and it was amazing. They were super brutal, super tight. They did a really cool variety of material, I thought, of where they played a lot of early stuff from like their first couple of records, and then they also played stuff from their most recent albums. They just came out with a new record very recently, so it was a cool mixture of things, and they kept the energy going, and it was amazing. Like, they were really good. I love Cannibal Corpse. I have, a long history with, I remember as a kid getting into them and getting their first album, Eaten Back to Life, on cassette. They were one of the first bands I got into as far as death metal. Like, when the whole, of course, they were from Florida, and they were part of the whole death metal explosion, and from that came out of Florida. You obviously Morbid Angel, Obituary, Deicide, and Cannibal. Like, it was a mega explosion, and those bands were the first death metal bands I got into, and then I got into the European death metal bands. After that, and then eventually black metal after that. But that was so I got into timeline wise, I was into, or I'd heard Cannibal a few years before Mayhem, and I remember I got into the death metal scene big time. First it was thrash metal, and then I got into the more extreme stuff and Cannibal Corpse, and got really into that. And then I don't know, it's probably 2 years or 3 years later, probably close to 3 years, was when I first heard black metal. And when I first heard black metal, it was those bands I mentioned, Emperor and Mayhem, and those things. So roughly the timeline of how long I've known both of these bands and how long I've loved their music is pretty much the same. And when you think about it, close to 40 years, and that's nuts. And both of those bands, especially Cannibal Corpse, are bigger now than ever. And the energy that these guys put out, it was incredible. Both bands, like the energy, they sound like they're 18. And and Cannibal was just crushing it. And I would, as long as I've loved them as a band, I've never gotten a chance to see them, which is crazy because they have a huge track record with playing lots of tours. They're a very, very active band. They have these massive tour cycles, and for some reason I never got to see them earlier back in the day. I just never did. But and the same thing with Mayhem. It was a different thing with Mayhem because they're from Norway, so there was it was rare at one point for them to come to the States, and now they've been coming to the States more often. It's been more like every tour cycle now, they tend to always come to the United States now, whereas before, it wasn't a thing, so they would only stay in Europe. So it's different for that aspect, which is great. But it was amazing. It was simply amazing to see two legendary bands, iconic bands that are so important to the scene, to the black metal scene. You have like Mayhem representing the black metal scene, and then Cannibal representing the death metal scene, and kind of this cross pollination of two different audiences. There was at one point the black metal scene was very different and separate from the death metal scene, and vice versa. You had kids that would not really mix up those genres together, and now it's cross pollinated completely. So the fan base has just exploded, and now there's all kinds of people checking out the music. And so I think it's amazing from that standpoint on how the whole scene has grown, and that there's less, I guess, borders around the idea of what genre is, or, well, we like what we like, so we're cooler than them, so they can't like what we like. I feel like that whole thing is gone. That's gone. Now it's just, I think it's people are liking the stuff because just strictly out of being fans of music, and that's it. And there's no hang-ups or perimeters around that anymore. And I think that's really great. And I think to a degree that's happened. One of the real positive things with the internet, I think that's one thing that's contributed one of the good things I think the internet has contributed to that kind of process. But overall, a phenomenal show. You know, uh, it was so worth it. Pretty exhausted, but totally worth it. And I would go see them in a heartbeat. Uh, Next chance I get, especially getting a chance to see Mayhem, because I think getting a chance even now is a little bit of a harder. It's a little bit more rare to see them than it is Cannibal, but amazing, amazing venue, and Palladium is a killer venue to see music. So I will definitely stay in the loop to see what else is, what other shows are coming down the pike. So I wanted to do this show where I just talked about last night's experience, and it was what a night. So what a day. So thanks again. This is Jason Dean, and we will see you next time. Peace.